The fluorescent lights hummed like a mechanical heartbeat as Katie Rodriguez pushed through the employee entrance at Oak Creek Memorial in San Diego, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, her scrubs still smelling faintly of the laundromat detergent she used because the hospital's industrial washers left residue that made her skin itch. 23 years and 4 months of field medicine had taught her to notice textures, chemicals, air pressure. Survival lived in the details. Graveyard shift. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The hours when most people slept and hospitals became something closer to war zones without the shooting. She moved through the corridors with an economy of motion that made her nearly invisible, her footfalls quiet, her shoulders slightly inward, the posture of someone trained to slip through crowds without drawing attention. In her previous life, the life that had ended with a classified order and a redacted file, she had moved through concrete ruins with this exact same precision. The Navy had been very clear: Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez no longer existed. Katie Rodriguez was her second identity, constructed carefully, documents forged by people whose names she would never know, a reset button that the Pentagon had pressed after Operation Phantom Vengeance turned into a diplomatic catastrophe that required everyone involved to vanish. The night supervisor, Margaret Chen, was waiting at the main nursing station with a folder and a tired smile. "You're the new hire on nights. Welcome to the graveyard." She handed Katie a worn jacket, lost and found, navy blue and faded. This was on the rack for 3 weeks. Nobody claimed it. Keep it if you want. Gets cold in those ICU rooms. Katie took the jacket, and her breath caught, barely perceptible, just a slight pause in her inhale, because sewn inside the lining was a faded unit patch. Ramadi. 2009, the insignia of her fire team, embroidered in thread that had faded to nearly invisible gray. She folded it carefully, her hand steady, and set it in her locker without comment. The muscle memory of field medicine was one thing. Actual artifacts from that life were supposed to have been classified and destroyed. Katie closed the locker door and felt the weight of something she couldn't name pressing against her ribs. "You'll start with the general medical floors tonight," Margaret continued, not noticing the slight tension in Katie's jaw. "Room 347 is critical. John Doe, admitted 3 days ago. Massive chest trauma, infection markers off the charts, refusing treatment from everyone who comes near him. Usually we'd move him to comfort care, but his paperwork flags him for continued aggressive intervention. Honestly, he's been a nightmare. But here's your responsibility now." Katie nodded, her voice soft when she spoke. "I'll manage." The words came out exactly as they were supposed to, the deferential, quiet, the voice of someone who would not challenge the hierarchy. "Thank you, Margaret." The corridors of Oak Creek Memorial smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, and something underneath those industrial cleaners, the smell of human deterioration trying to be masked. Katie's boots moved silently across the linoleum. The hospital was a different kind of war zone, all fluorescent lights and beeping monitors instead of concrete dust and diesel exhaust, but the principle was identical: stay alert, stay quiet, notice everything, show nothing. Room 347 was in the ICU wing, behind 2 sets of double doors that hissed open like mechanical lungs. The patient, commander rank notation on the chart, body language screaming active duty military even in unconsciousness, lay in the bed with massive chest bandaging, his breathing shallow and labored, the ventilator beside him delivering oxygen in rhythmic wheeze. His skin had that grey-blue tint of infection, septic, the body eating itself from the inside. Massive trauma. Blunt force, the chart said, from a classified incident that the medical records had redacted in thick black marker. Katie approached the bed with her assessment already beginning before she touched anything. Vitals on the monitor: heart rate 127, blood pressure 89/54 and dropping, O2 sat 72 and climbing slowly on high-flow oxygen, core temperature 38.9 Celsius. The man's left arm was exposed, and Katie noticed something that made every muscle in her body go rigid for just a fraction of a second. On his forearm, in block letters, was a tattoo. Her own name. * Rodriguez star. She did not flinch. She did not pause. She reached forward and checked the peripheral line, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had held trauma compression bandages on wounds while rounds were incoming, and her breathing stayed exactly as it was supposed to, shallow, controlled, professional. The fever in his eyes when they fluttered briefly suggested confusion, delirium, no recognition. The man was septic and hallucinatory. He had no idea who was standing beside his bed. She was standing beside someone who had her name permanently inked on his skin. Katie moved to his chart and read the full history, redacted in places that made it clear this patient was connected to classified operations, just like she was. The chest trauma was recent, within the last 72 hours. The infection was secondary, opportunistic, taking advantage of a body already compromised by massive blunt force. He was refusing all treatment, the nursing note said, pushing away doctors and nurses, hostile when lucid, non-responsive to pain medication offers. He had pulled his fur twice. He had torn off monitors 3 separate times. Status check, a voice came from behind her, and Katie turned to see Dr. Sterling in the doorway. He was tall, salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, expensive shoes that clicked against the floor when he walked, the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of assuming he was the smartest person in every room. He was observing her with the casual appraisal of someone examining a piece of equipment that had been delivered to his OR. New nurse? Katie Rodriguez. She kept her voice soft, kept her eyes down slightly, the posture of deference, and turned from the patient bed. First shift. I'm providing baseline assessment. Dr. Sterling's gaze moved across her, lingering on the way her scrubs fit, the way her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, the absence of anything that suggested competence or authority. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The assessment. The dismissal. He was building a narrative, mousy, quiet, probably wouldn't last more than a few weeks on graveyard, no threat to the structure he had spent 2 decades constructing. Well, he's all yours. Try not to waste too much time on him. DNR is standing by if he codes. Not worth the resources. He clicked away down the corridor. Katie stood in the silence of room 347, listening to the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze, watching the oxygen saturation number on the monitor climb slowly from 72 to 74 to 75, and she looked down at the man with her name on his arm. She had pulled people out of burning buildings with less information than this. She had survived on less than this. But she had been trained to survive, trained to compartmentalize, trained to show nothing. Katie reached for the trauma shears clipped to her scrub pocket. They had her call sign engraved on the handle, just barely visible, one more artifact she should have destroyed, and began the systematic assessment that would define this night. His heart rate was declining slightly. His blood pressure was stabilizing. The sepsis was advanced, but the body, even a body that seemed to be giving up, still had reserves. Still had fight. She placed her hand on his shoulder, just for a moment, long enough to assess the warmth of his skin, the rigidity of his muscles underneath the hospital gown. His eyes moved under the lids, REM sleep or fever hallucinations. He would not remember her being here. He would not remember the woman standing beside his bed who had carried men like him through Ramadi on nothing but adrenaline and pure refusal to let go. Katie turned back to the monitors, reading the data like a language she had always spoken, and she began her vigil over a man whose name was written on her skin, a man she had lost 16 years ago to an operation the Navy had spent millions trying to erase, a man who carried her name on his arm like a promise that somehow, against all odds and all logic, had survived. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a place where people pretended everything was fine. Dr. Sterling stood at the center of the room during shift change, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to absolute deference. $20 as the quiet one doesn't make it to Friday. His residents circled him like planets around the sun, and their laughter arrived on cue, mechanical and obedient. These nursing school graduates wash out when they meet real medicine. One of them marked the bet on the whiteboard in blue marker, the numbers already taking shape, Sterling 1, new nurse 0. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the sound of institutional indifference. Nobody questioned Dr. Sterling. Not anymore. Katie entered the break room 5 minutes later, a shift stretching ahead of her like an ocean with no visible shore. She had survived worse than a bet whispered in her hearing. She had survived mortar fire and IED blasts and the kind of silence that follows when half your team doesn't come home. She pulled a tray from the stack, moved through the serving line with the efficiency of someone used to consuming food as fuel rather than pleasure, and chose a table in the corner where the wall could be at her back. Old habits. Always old habits. Dr. Sterling approached with the deliberate confidence of a man who had never experienced genuine consequences. His white coat moved like a cape, expensive and pressed, the kind of garment that whispered money and family connections and a brother-in-law who was chief of surgery at Scripps. He made eye contact with Katie across the room, just for a fraction of a second, then executed a subtle hip check against the edge of her tray. The impact was small but perfect in its precision. The tray flipped upward at an angle that sent her turkey sandwich, apple slices, and juice box scattering across the tile floor in a pattern that looked almost choreographed. Her plate clattered with a sound like a small alarm. The juice box burst against the floor, spreading into a widening amber stain. His residence erupted. Not genuine laughter, the kind of noise a pack makes when the alpha makes a kill. Sterling stood above her, coffee cup steady in his hand, his smile the smile of someone who had spent 20 years building a kingdom on the backs of people too afraid to push back. Careful, mouse. Wouldn't want you to quit before I collect my winnings. Katie took one measured breath. She knelt on the floor with the controlled grace of someone trained in environments far more dangerous than a hospital cafeteria, her scrubs pressing against the tile. She began collecting the debris, apple slices, bread crumbs, the crushed juice box, with methodical precision. Her movements were economical, practiced, the muscle memory of someone who had picked up far heavier things than scattered food. She cleaned the floor with paper towels from the dispenser, wiped the tile until it was spotless, and disposed of everything in the waste bin. When she stood, her eyes were dry. Almost. One tear escaped as she reached for the sink, a single tear that tracked down her cheek with the inevitability of rain on glass. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let Sterling see it. She let all of them see it, the residents, the other nurses, everyone watching to see if she would break. Then she wiped it away with the back of her hand, rinsed her hands until they were clean, and walked past Sterling's station without looking at him. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of complete indifference. I'm going on break. Nobody laughed. The next night arrived with the weight of accumulated humiliation hanging in the air between them like something physical. Katie approached the nurse's station where Dr. Sterling reviewed patient charts, his pen moving with the authority of someone who believed himself infallible. She held Commander Doe's updated vitals, blood pressure stable, oxygen saturation holding at 92%, heart rate normalized on the current medications. The chart was meticulous, her documentation precise and complete. Sterling flipped through the pages without looking at her face. She watched him read her notes, the vital sign trends, the medication administration record, the clinical assessments. His jaw tightened with each page. Then he did something that had likely worked countless times before. He hurled the chart downward, paper scattering across the floor like white birds startled into flight. Pick that up, sweetheart. And while you're down there, explain why you ordered a cardiology consult without attending approval. The nurse's station fell into the kind of silence that precedes violence or transformation, and Katie could not yet tell which. She knelt and began collecting the pages with methodical care, assembling them in their proper order, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she stood, she held the chart smoothly reassembled, and her eyes met his without looking away. One tear escaped. She wiped it with the back of her hand. I've picked up heavier things than your ego, doctor. The silence that followed was absolute. Sterling's face flushed a shade of red that might have been anger or humiliation or the first real recognition that something in his carefully constructed hierarchy had shifted. The other nurses at the station had stopped moving, stopped pretending to work. Katie placed the chart on the desk between them with the precision of placing an artifact in a museum case, respectful, final, irrevocable. Then she turned and walked toward room 347, her shoulders squared, her steps measured, her composure intact. Sterling's voice followed her down the hallway. "You think you're clever, Mouse?" But it carried less certainty now. The words hit her back like water, running off the surface of something harder than he had anticipated. Later that shift, in the supply closet where Sterling had cornered her between the saline bottles and the four tubing, his voice dropped into something that might have been a threat. "You're a liability waiting to happen. One mistake and I'll have your license." Katie reached past him for a box of supplies, her movements efficient and unhurried. Then she spoke, and her voice sounded like it came from somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere that had survived things he could not fathom. "Then I won't make one." She left him standing among the supplies, and he did not follow. By 2300 hours that same shift, Katie entered room 347 for routine vitals and noticed the wrongness immediately. The commander's breathing was shallow, his neck veins distended like branches in spring, his skin mottled the color of old concrete. The monitor showed a blood pressure dropping in real time, 104, 98, 86, and his heart rate climbing in compensation. 85 beats per minute. 94. 112. The oxygen saturation fell like a sinking stone, 96, 93, 89. She pressed the call button. She requested the attending. The floor resident arrived within 2 minutes, took one look at the patient, and said he would call Dr. Sterling. Katie checked the patient a second time, lifted his hospital gown to examine his chest, and saw something that made her hands start to shake, the same hands that had held others steady through fire, that had controlled themselves through years of discipline and training. The tattoo on his right forearm, visible now in the fluorescent light, Rodriguez. Her surname. Her name in block letters. She forced her hands to still. She focused on the clinical picture instead of the impossible thing staring back at her. Muffled heart sounds, distended jugular veins, narrowing pulse pressure. Cardiac tamponade. The clinical presentation was unmistakable. The resident returned 5 minutes later. "Dr. Sterling says to monitor and call him if status changes significantly." Katie moved to the belongings bag hanging on the door hook. Inside, a wallet with no identification but a faded unit patch, Ramadi operation insignia, the same one sewn into the lining of her jacket in her locker, the same symbol that had meant something in a time before this, in a place where identities were erased and names were classified and Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez became no one at all. She returned to the bedside, examined the commander's pupils, unfocused, unseeing, locked in the fever that had consumed him for 6 days. She lifted the hospital gown again, studied the tattoo, searched the scarred skin underneath as if she could read her own history written there. At 2,347 hours, she pulled up the patient chart history. Every physician who had attempted examination had documented the same thing: patient refuses care, combative when approached, attempted physical restraint necessary. The admission notes told a partial story: found unresponsive in an alley at 0300 hours, massive chest trauma consistent with explosion or fall, sepsis developing from untreated wounds, no identification, no family contact, DNR order signed by hospital administration. Katie stared at the date the DNR was signed, 3 days ago. She picked up the phone to call Sterling again, her finger already moving toward his extension. Before she could dial, the monitor alarm screamed. Room 347. Code blue. The monitor showed asystole, a flat line that meant either a catastrophic mechanical failure or the moment when everything changed forever. The monitor showed asystole. A flat line that meant either a catastrophic mechanical failure or the moment when everything changed forever. Katie's hands were already moving before her brain caught up, muscle memory from Ramadi taking over, the part of her that had stopped thinking and started surviving. Room 347 went from quiet to controlled chaos in 4 seconds. The overnight resident, a second-year named Chen, was already at the bedside with the crash cart rolling in behind him. His face had that hollow look of someone trained to follow protocols but unprepared for the weight of actual death. "Start compressions," Katie said. Not a request. It wasn't how a graveyard shift nurse talked to a resident. It was how a senior chief petty officer talked to a junior enlisted sailor who'd forgotten what they were trained to do. Chen hesitated for exactly 1 beat. Then he positioned his hands and began. His compressions were adequate but mechanical, lacking the rhythm that came from understanding that each compression was either keeping a man alive or wasting time he didn't have. Katie's eyes moved across the monitor, across the commander's grey face, across the distended neck veins that screamed one diagnosis louder than anything a textbook could teach. She'd seen this before. In a compound in Ramadi. In a Humvee that had taken a direct hit from an IED. In the field, where there were no helicopters 5 minutes away, no surgeons waiting in an OR. Just your hands and what you could remember and the absolute knowledge that if you failed, a man died in the dirt. The crash cart arrived. Defibrillator pads, for trays, medications lined up like ammunition. The tech looked at Katie. Shock or rhythm check? Katie was already reaching for her phone. Rhythm check. Then get me the ultrasound. Now. She dialed Dr. Sterling's cell. It rang once. Twice. 3 times. On the 4th ring, his voice came through, groggy, irritated, with the tone of a man being pulled from something far more important than a patient's life. This better be good, Mouse. The nickname landed like a physical thing. She let it pass through her like a bullet through water. Commander in room 347. Vitals are critical. BP 60/40 and dropping. Heart rate 140, thready. Shallow respirations. Distended neck veins. Mottled skin. Katie's voice was level as a laser. Clinical picture is tamponade. He needs emergent pericardiocentesis or he arrests completely in the next 10 minutes. Maybe less. Silence on the other end. Not the silence of someone thinking. The silence of someone who'd already made his decision and was deciding how to phrase it. His DNR, correct. Sterling's voice had taken on the flat tone of procedure. Of hierarchy asserting itself. Of power being wielded like a scalpel. His chart says DNR, yes. But his altered mental status. Septic. He never consented to a DNR order while conscious. There's no witness signature, no. Katie. Sterling's voice carried the weight of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to shut down a conversation. He's a John Doe. He refused all treatment from every physician who's approached him. He wants to die. Let him die. Call the attending on duty if you want to waste his time. You are not, and I want to be absolutely clear on this, you are not qualified to perform any invasive procedure without direct supervision from an attending physician. Follow the DNR. Document the time of death. And stop wasting my time. The line went dead. Katie set the phone down on the crash cart. Her hands were steady. Everything about her was steady, except for the thing inside that recognized the impossible geometry of the moment, save this man and expose herself, or follow protocol and watch him die. Chen was still compressions. 30 chest compressions, then Katie moved in and checked the carotid pulse. Nothing. His eyes had that glazed look of someone whose brain was already 3 minutes gone from lack of oxygen. Every compression was carrying diminishing returns. Within another minute, even if they got a heartbeat back, his brain would be too damaged to recover. He's still asystole, the tech reported, watching the monitor. The flat line marched across the screen like a metronome counting down to nothing. Katie pulled up the ultrasound. The probe felt familiar in her hands. She'd used this exact machine exactly 3 times during her nursing training, but she'd used ultrasound in Ramadi every time someone took shrapnel or gunshot wounds and she needed to know what was bleeding into where. The anatomy didn't change between a military compound and a civilian hospital. The human body was the human body. She found the pericardial sac in 2 moves. And there it was. Blood. Fluid filling the space around the commander's heart, crushing it, preventing it from filling. The textbook definition of tamponade. The reason he was dying. Chen was sweating now. His compressions were slowing. How much longer, he asked. Hoping she'd call it. Hoping she'd let the protocol make the decision instead of making it himself. Katie looked at the commander's face. at the name tattooed on his forearm in block letters. Rodriguez. Her own name, written on his skin like a prayer or a curse or something that existed in the space between. The explicit warning echoed in her mind. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez can never surface again without triggering an international incident that would bury her in a cell instead of a cemetery. Using her SEAL training would surface her. Saving his life would end her second one. The resident met her eyes. Waiting. Needing her to tell him it was okay to stop. That they'd done everything they could. Katie moved to the supply cart and selected an 18-gauge spinal needle. Her hands were steady. Everything about her was steady. Keep compressions, she said to Chen. Don't stop. She prepped the subxiphoid area with betadine, and the smell of it, sharp, chemical, antiseptic, brought back every field operation she'd ever worked. The thing about field medicine under fire was that you didn't think. You didn't debate. You moved. Your hands remembered what your brain wasn't allowed to acknowledge. The resident's eyes widened. You can't, we need an attending for. I just did, Katie said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not angry. Worse than angry. Cold. The kind of cold that came from having made a choice that would either save a life or destroy one. She advanced the needle at a 45-degree angle, just below the xiphoid process, aiming toward the left shoulder. Anatomical landmarks only. No imaging this time because she'd done it before when the only landmarks were what you could feel and what you could remember and what your training wouldn't let you forget. The needle advanced past skin. Subcutaneous tissue. Then muscle. She felt it, that specific resistance, as the pericardium came into contact with the needle tip. Then the give. The release. The needle entering the effusion. She withdrew the plunger. Blood came back. Dark blood. 300 ccs, maybe more, pooling in the syringe. Each cc was pressure being released. Each cc was the commander's heart getting a chance to beat again. The monitor showed activity. Electrical activity. Not organized yet. But something. Something that meant the tamponade was releasing, that his heart had room to fill again. Compressions, Katie said. Slower now. Let him sink to the electrical activity. Chen kept going. His compressions matched the emerging rhythm. 30 compressions. Then Katie moved in and checked the carotid pulse. There. Barely. A faint thump under her fingertips like a bird's heartbeat. Like something that wanted to keep living if given just half a chance. We have a pulse, the tech whispered. The monitor beeped. Once. Then again. Then it found a rhythm, slow, irregular, but organizing itself into something that resembled a heartbeat. Katie withdrew another 150 ccs of blood from the pericardium. The relief was immediate. The commander's chest rose. A spontaneous breath. Then another. His eyes were still closed. His face was still gray. But he was breathing. His heart was beating. The asystole had lifted like a fog that had been holding him underwater, and he'd broken the surface. Katie withdrew the needle and pressed a gauze pad to the puncture site. Her hands were moving through the motions of securing and of getting him on supplemental oxygen, of doing all the things that came after you'd just performed a procedure that should have required 3 different attending physicians and a surgical suite. Chen was staring at her like she'd just performed magic on a patient who was supposed to be dead. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The ventilator wheezed. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, not perfect, not strong, but alive. The commander's oxygen saturation was climbing. 85. 90. 94. Katie's phone was in her pocket. She'd need to call Sterling. She'd need to call the attending. She'd need to document exactly what she'd just done and why, and the fact that she'd performed an invasive procedure without physician supervision. She'd need to surface. But first, she needed to keep this man alive. The commander's heart was failing in real time. Katie could hear it in the monitor's rhythm, a staccato irregularity that meant the pericardial sac was filling with blood, squeezing the cardiac chambers, choking the life out of a man who'd survived Ramadi. The resident had retreated to the nurse's station 20 minutes ago. Dr. Sterling still wasn't answering his phone. Katie stood at the bedside, watching the oxygen saturation drop from 94 to 91 to 88, watching the blood pressure crater toward shock, knowing that in the next 4 minutes this man would arrest and she would watch him die because protocol demanded she wait for a doctor who'd already decided he wasn't worth the effort. She'd picked up heavier things than ego. She'd carried them through fire. Katie moved to the supply cart, hand steady as a surgical laser, pulling a sterile tray. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Syringe. Ultrasound probe. She'd done this in Ramadi with nothing but field intuition and the knowledge that hesitation meant death. She had her field intuition now, and she had something else, the memory of a commander's arm bearing her name in black letters, a man from a life that was supposed to be erased. The classification order didn't matter anymore. The medical board didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the 60 seconds between now and the moment when his heart would simply stop. She prepped his chest with antiseptic, the sharp chemical smell cutting through the hospital's ambient staleness. The ultrasound revealed the effusion, a dark pocket of blood surrounding the heart like a fist slowly closing. 2 centimeters at the widest point. Enough to kill him. Just barely enough to fix. Katie found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She positioned the needle. The room's fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous drone as she took a breath, let muscle memory surface from beneath 16 years of civilian life. Her hands moved on their own, the needle sliding through skin, through fascia, through the pericardial membrane with a sensation like puncturing a balloon. The plunger came back and dark blood filled the syringe. 50 cubic centimeters. The monitor's rhythm steadied slightly. Katie's jaw clenched. She was doing this, actually doing this, stepping so far beyond protocol that there was no coming back. She withdrew the syringe, reattached a fresh one, pulled again. 100 cubic centimeters now. The commander's oxygen saturation climbed to 90, then 92. His blood pressure twitched upward. She pulled a third time. 150. Her shoulders didn't shake. Her breathing stayed even. The patient gasped, a real breath, not the shallow wounded thing he'd been doing before. Katie withdrew the fourth syringe, 200 cubic centimeters of blood that had been suffocating his heart, and watched the monitor transform. Heart rate dropped from 142 to 112 to 98. Blood pressure climbed to 90/60. The cardiac rhythm shifted into something that resembled sinus, weak but alive, like a man waking up from a nightmare. She withdrew the needle, applied pressure to the puncture site with a sterile gauze pad, and stood motionless for 30 seconds, watching the strip of telemetry paper roll out of the machine, watching the new baseline emerge, a rhythm that meant survival instead of collapse. The resident appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. "What did you do?" "Pericardiocentesis," Katie said, her voice level as concrete. "Cardiac tamponade. 200 cc effusion." The resident's face went pale. "You didn't, you can't. He was going to die. I'll document everything." Katie hung another 4 bag, pushed fluids through the central line, adjusted the norepinephrine infusion higher. She grabbed the ultrasound probe again, confirmed the effusion had decreased, confirmed the cardiac chambers were expanding properly, confirmed the pericardium was no longer a coffin. She pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. The resident hovered for an hour, radioing the attending, getting transferred through 3 different supervisors, each voice more panicked than the last. Finally someone told him to just stay with the patient and monitor. The resident gave up and went to chart. Katie stayed. She didn't leave. She checked vitals every 15 minutes, blood pressure climbing steadily toward normal, heart rate stabilizing, oxygen saturation holding at 95% on just 2 liters of oxygen instead of the 10 he'd needed before. She adjusted the antibiotic drip when the cultures came back positive for streptococcal infection, pushed another dose of dopamine when his systolic dipped below 100, changed the 4 bag when it ran empty. At 0300 hours she sat in that chair and watched a man she thought was dead come back from the edge of the abyss. The commander's breathing deepened into something like sleep. His hand, which had been clenched into a fist, relaxed against the bedsheet. Katie pulled her chair closer and stayed through the long hours when the ICU was a cathedral of beeping machines and whispered conversation at the far end of the hallway, staying when the night shift changed at 0600, staying when the morning crew arrived and the ward filled with people and noise and the terrible business of keeping people alive. At 0800 hours, the commander's vitals were stable, blood pressure 110/70, heart rate 85, oxygen saturation 96% on room air, temperature finally dropping from 103.2 to 101.8, the sepsis markers beginning their slow climb toward normal. Katie had been awake for 16 hours straight. Her scrubs were soaked with sweat and blood. There was a small smear of the commander's blood on her left temple where she'd touched her forehead, but she didn't wipe it away. She updated the chart with clinical precision, each intervention documented, each medication dose recorded, each vital sign plotted in the electronic system like a map of resurrection. The pericardiocentesis entry was there, stark and deliberate, emergency bedside procedure performed by RN Rodriguez, 0215 hours, indication acute cardiac tamponade, outcome, patient stabilized, improvement in vital signs, effusion resolved from 2 centimeters to less than 0.5 centimeters. She didn't elaborate. She didn't apologize. The documentation was truth, nothing more. Dr. Sterling appeared at 0800 exactly, entering the ICU with his resident trailing behind like a satellite caught in orbit. He saw the commander sitting up slightly, oxygen saturation normal, chest rising and falling with real breath, not the shallow desperate gasping of 6 hours ago. He saw the procedure tray on the counter. He saw Katie sitting in the chair beside the bed, her uniform stained, her eyes tracking every number on the monitors with the focused attention of someone who'd been trained to notice when humans were dying. Sterling's face went white, then flooded with red like someone was filling him with angry blood. He turned and walked directly out of the ICU without saying a word to Katie, without looking at the commander, without acknowledging that anything had changed. Katie heard him on his phone 15 seconds later, heard him in his office making calls, heard his voice rising and falling as he spoke to people whose names she didn't know and didn't care about. 30 minutes later, the ICU supervisor arrived with security. Katie's supervisor was behind them, eyes fixed on the floor. The supervisor's hands shook as she extended them toward Katie. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Dr. Sterling has filed a formal complaint with the medical board. Performing an invasive procedure without physician supervision. You're suspended pending investigation. I need your badge." Katie unfastened her badge and handed it over. The plastic was still warm from her chest. She stood up from the chair, looked back at the commander one final time, his eyes following her with a clarity that broke something in her chest, and turned toward the door. Security escorted her to her locker. She packed the cracked World's Okayest Nurse mug into a cardboard box, the dying succulent from her desk, the photograph of her fire team with the faces crossed out by distance and death and classified documents. She pulled her jacket from the back hook, the old jacket with the faded Ramadi patch sewn into the lining, and added it to the box. The weight of everything was exactly what she expected, barely anything at all, reduced to cardboard and memory and the smell of antiseptic that clung to her uniform like a permanent stain. She walked through the ICU lobby as morning shift arrived, colleagues staring, their eyes sliding away from hers like she'd become something shameful. She pressed the button for the elevator, rode it down to the ground floor, walked out through the automatic doors into San Diego rain that felt like judgment. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. Katie stood under the overhang clutching the cardboard box, rain soaking through its bottom, the mug and succulent and photograph going soft with moisture, watching the water run off the edge of the shelter onto the sidewalk below. She pressed her forehead against the metal frame and took one long breath, the kind of breath people take when they're about to surface from underwater and don't know if there's air waiting above. Behind her, in the hospital, Dr. Sterling was dialing the first of 4 phone calls. The first to board member Hutchins about liability exposure. The second to her nursing school asking about disciplinary history, digging for anything he could weaponize. The third to the state licensing board with a formal complaint. The fourth to an outside investigator named Brennan who'd been in Sterling's pocket for years, hired to conduct an independent review that would document exactly what Sterling wanted documented, that Katie Rodriguez was a rogue nurse, unfit for practice, dangerous, unreliable, a threat. Dr. Sterling arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 0800 hours sharp, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of a man who had never questioned his own dominance. He moved toward the ICU with the swagger of someone accustomed to obedience, his pressed white coat unbuttoned, his stethoscope draped like a ceremonial scarf. Then he saw room 347. Katie stood at the bedside, her back to him, and the commander's monitors displayed something Sterling had written off as impossible 8 hours ago: stable sinus rhythm. Blood pressure 118/76. O2 saturation 96%. Breathing on his own. Alive. Sterling's footsteps slowed. His jaw tightened. He could read the scene with the precision of a predator recognizing a territorial challenge, the deflated 4 bags, the documentation in Katie's handwriting, the precise angle of the empty needle wrapper on the instrument tray. Someone had performed an emergency procedure. Someone had done what Sterling had explicitly forbidden. Someone had saved a patient he'd already consigned to the DNR list. Sterling didn't enter the room. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked toward his office, his mind already moving through the network he'd spent 20 years constructing, board members who owed him favors, administrators dependent on his reputation, allies positioned at every leverage point. By 08:15, he was at his desk, phone in hand. The first call went to Richard Bancroft, chief of the medical board, a man who'd hired Sterling 15 years ago and had never questioned a single decision he'd made. Richard, we have a serious problem at Oak Creek. An unsupervised nurse performed a complex cardiac procedure without physician authorization. We're looking at liability exposure, credential violations, potential patient endangerment. Sterling's voice carried the weight of institutional authority. I need documentation in place before this becomes an incident report. Bancroft's response was immediate. He would look into it, pull the records, have a conversation with administration. The call lasted 90 seconds. The second call went to Janet Cho, Director of Clinical Operations. Sterling presented the situation differently this time, framed it as a breach of protocol by an overzealous new hire, a threat to the hospital's quality assurance standards, a potential JCAHO violation during accreditation review. We need to act quickly, Janet, before this hits the board level. Janet promised an immediate inquiry. The call lasted 2 minutes. The third call went to hospital legal, where Sterling described Katie's actions as potentially criminal, practicing medicine without a license, exceeding her scope of practice, willfully endangering a patient by performing a procedure only physicians were authorized to perform. The legal counsel listened and took notes. I want to protect the hospital, Sterling said, his voice carrying a tone of deep concern, but we can't ignore this. By 08:30, Sterling opened his computer and drafted an email to 3 of Katie's references from her nursing school, faculty members he knew socially, people who might have concerns about her background, her training, her mental stability. I'm reaching out regarding Katie Rodriguez, who recently joined our clinical staff. We've had some concerns about her judgment and decision-making in high-stress situations. I wondered if you'd noticed anything during her clinical rotations that might explain some of her behavior. The email was a fishing expedition, crafted to look like collegial concern. It was a trap. At 08:45, Sterling filed a formal complaint with the California Board of Registered Nursing. The complaint was detailed, specific, and devastating. Nurse Katie Rodriguez performed an unauthorized cardiac procedure on a patient without physician oversight, including needle insertion into a vital cavity. She exceeded her scope of practice without regard for patient safety or institutional protocol. She refused to stop even when ordered by the attending physician. This represents a danger to public health and patient welfare. I am requesting an immediate investigation. Sterling attached photographs of the procedure site, documentation of the vital signs before and after, and a statement claiming Katie had acted without any medical supervision whatsoever. The complaint was filed electronically within minutes. By 0900, Sterling had already made the fourth move, the one that would truly end her. He called Brennan, the investigator he'd cultivated for 7 years, a man who conducted independent reviews that somehow always reached the conclusion Sterling needed them to reach. Brennan was a former hospital administrator with connections throughout the state's regulatory apparatus, and more importantly, he was deeply in debt to Sterling. Sterling had intervened when Brennan's medical license had faced revocation for substance abuse issues, had helped him pivot to investigation work, had kept him solvent through retainers and consulting fees that mysteriously appeared in his bank account. Brennan owed Sterling everything. "I need you to conduct an independent investigation into a nurse at Oak Creek," Sterling said. "It needs to look official, unbiased, thorough. But I need the conclusion to be clear. This nurse is dangerous, unfit for practice, a threat to patient safety. I'm sending you everything you need." What Sterling sent was a curated file, the complaint, the references to Katie's military background with just enough redaction to seem secretive and suspicious, the procedure documentation twisted to look like reckless endangerment, and a summary from Sterling himself that read like expert testimony, detailed, authoritative, and completely one-sided. Brennan called back within 30 minutes. "I've got this. Full investigation by end of week. Official report will recommend immediate credential suspension pending board review. I'll make it bulletproof, unbiased, objective, unable to refute. The fee would be $8,000. Sterling approved it without hesitation. By noon, Katie was being escorted out of Oak Creek Memorial by 2 security officers, one on each side. Her supervisor, Maria Gonzalez, walked beside her with an expression of profound apology, her hands literally tied by the weight of Sterling's institutional machinery. The board had intervened. Legal had advised suspension pending investigation. Hospital policy required immediate removal of any staff member under formal regulatory complaint. Maria had fought for her, had tried to explain about Katie's medical knowledge, her precision, her clear documentation of the emergency, but the machine was already rolling, and Maria was a supervisor, not a board member. She had no power against the network Sterling had activated. Katie carried a cardboard box out through the emergency department entrance. Inside, a cracked World's Okayest nurse mug from a Secret Santa exchange, a dying succulent someone had given her on her first day, a photo of her fire team from Ramadi with half the faces crossed out by death, the ones who hadn't made it home. The box felt heavier than it should have been, as if it contained the weight of her second failed life. By evening, Katie stood at a rain-soaked bus stop on Mission Boulevard, the cardboard box in her hands, water darkening the edges and threatening to dissolve the bottom. Rain hammered the asphalt like an accusation. A bus pulled up, and she climbed aboard, found a seat in the back, and held the box against her chest. Nobody looked at her. She was just another person with nowhere else to be at 1847 hours on a Tuesday night, just another nurse thrown away by a system that protected its own. Her apartment was dark when she arrived. She set the box on the kitchen counter and turned on every light, as if brightness could erase what had happened. Discharge papers were already waiting. The hospital had sent her termination documentation through email. Hard copies would arrive by certified mail. She spread them across the kitchen table like an autopsy of her second failed existence, the way the first one had been autopsied 8 years ago when the classified operation in Ramadi had gone sideways. The memory played on loop, as it always did when she was alone. 14 Marines extracted across 3 kilometers of hostile territory. 2 KIA, 1 MEDEVAC'd, the rest made it back because she'd carried a wounded commander through enemy fire and kept him breathing until the extraction birds landed. That operation was supposed to be her redemption, a third chance after 2 failed attempts to stay in a normal life. But the operation had broken something at the highest levels. Someone had talked. Someone had compromised the classification. The Pentagon's response had been immediate and absolute: erase her. Bury her. Create a new identity. Become a ghost. Never surface again without triggering an international incident that would put her in a black site instead of a cemetery. So she disappeared into the medical field, into the graveyard shift, into a life where nobody asked questions and nobody looked too closely. For 6 years, it had worked. And then she'd walked into Oak Creek Memorial and found a man bearing her name tattooed on his skin, and everything had come apart again. Katie's phone rang at 2,144 hours. Unknown number. Hospital area code. She stared at it, watching the call counter tick through seconds. She didn't recognize the voice when she answered. "Is this Katie Rodriguez?" The voice was female, authoritative, professional. "This is Dr. Sarah Vance calling from Oak Creek Memorial. I'm the new chief of medicine. We need to talk about what happened to you, and I think we need to do it right now, because there are some people here who want to fight for you, and we're running out of time before Sterling's investigator submits his report. Can you come back? Tonight." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Katie said a single word, "When?" If you're still watching, hit that like button. And I want to know, would you have saved the man who fired you, or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe and let's see how this ends.